welcome back to the Top Order Podcast. This is the second part in our episode on the 21st century's most influential cricketers. If you listen to the 45 minutes or so worth of rambling, you'll have heard the runners and riders. We have broken for several days, come back in the same clothes for continuity, and we're now going to try and chisel four faces onto cricketing Mount Rushmore for the 21st century's most influential cricketers, broadly speaking. All coming up in a second on the Top Order Podcast. Stay tuned. I've got to say, this was a schmozzle, but it's been a really enjoyable schmozzle. We spent 45 minutes in a room. You've got the most potent blue Sharpie. Honestly, I am high as a kite off that Sharpie as you're scribbling down your little notes here and dots for votes and all kinds of stuff. But, Bordy, I think give us a little bit of an explainer as to how this second half's going to run, mainly for Lippy, otherwise he'll introduce another 7 New Zealand provincial cricketers that we need to consider.
Right, okay, so first thing, read my lips, no new names. Okay, so there's no honourable mentions, there's no more introduction of new evidence to proceedings. We have our list.
Noted.
Of potential Mount Rushmore most influential cricketers of the 21st century. And just for the listeners who may not have listened to the first episode and are joining us now for the first time, we're looking for influence and impact on cricket this century since 2000, not the best cricketers. So not necessarily the Tendulkars or the Pontings or the Sangakaras or name your favourite cricketer here, but we're looking for influence and impact on the world of cricket. Do we want to talk about, Adam, some of the categories or the groupings of players that have come out of our list and position it that way, or do we want to just go straight into who everyone has on their 4 and then go from there?
I think the way you guys talked about it just before when we were sort of framing this is a good way to set it up, because I do think we end up bunching them into categories. We might get to the end of the half an hour, 45 minutes that we're going to do this for and decide that actually 3 people from this category still deserve to be on our top 4. But I think, the way we sort of end up framing it is probably worth starting with the groupings of players so that we can debate against each other.
Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of creative license in the way that I describe this, but broadly speaking, what we've got the pioneers and the mavericks. So those are the people that have done something that has paved the way for others to potentially do something that a very traditional game hasn't always allowed. So in that category, we have got Chris Gayle, we've got Kevin Peterson, and Bordy's now just moved all the post-it notes around it. I think we've got Kieron, Pollard in there as well. We've then got people who have, for want of a better word, created environments, brought other people with them, built a dynasty or a legacy. And we've got Brendon McCullum for what he did with that New Zealand side of the 2010s and onwards, and then has transcended that into his coaching career. We've also got Andrew Strauss on that list for doing a similar thing with English cricket, starting his legacy in 2003 as a player, continuing it right through to a high performance review, which has then appointed the likes of Rob Key and Brendon McCullum to carry on England's rise in Test cricket after we'd reset that white ball piece for England. We've then got, the people who have brought others with them in a way that's transcended, a nation. And both the guys we've got in this category, Mahendra Singh Dhoni and Virat Kohli, have built cricketing sides over a period of time that have been so ingrained in the mould of their personality and their desire that I think that those go in that category. And we've then got, a group that sort of sits to the side of that. And that is people who have ultimately done something a little bit different. So we've got Tilakarani Dilshan in there as someone that broke ground with the way that he played T20 cricket and invented and brought shots into the game that we've never seen. We've got Adam Gilchrist, who changed the way that we look at wicket keepers in particularly Test match cricket. And then we've got 2 bowlers from some of the smaller nations that have played cricket, over the course of the last century. And that's Rashid Khan from Afghanistan in the way that he's brought a new style of leg spin, which I'm sure, Stu, you can talk to the nuance of, not to mention Bordy, as well as our resident leg spinner. And then we've also got Lasith Malinga as well, who obviously had a terribly unusual action, changed the colour that umpires needed to wear, rubbed the ball on his belly for good luck, and possibly had, the biggest case for a L'Oreal commercial that any cricketer's ever had. I don't know whether he ever got that call for his Frizz Ease conditioner. But those are the people that we've got in the, I think, in that list, haven't we? Have I missed anybody?
I don't think you have.
Well, Ellyse Perry's on there as well.
And sorry, we've got Ellyse Perry in that group as well as, look, I guess a pioneer. Bordy mentioned in the first episode, World Cups in both cricket and soccer or football for those of you in the Northern Hemisphere, and one of the best plus minuses in terms of all-rounders in the game ever. So that's the categories that we've got. Let's start with the first one. So should we start with this, I guess what we call the Mavericks, or the guys that have pioneered probably that sort of move to T20 franchise and broken down probably some of the financial models of the game, really. And that's Kieron Pollard, Chris Gayle, and Kevin Peterson, isn't it, Bordy?
Can I? Yeah, because I think this is a fascinating one because, as much as we don't like it, I mean, you talked before, right at the start of the first episode about, has it been good for the game? And I think in terms of all of us sitting here, we prefer the other formats of the game over T20. But I think you could, I think maybe Raj made the point that it's the most watched format of the game, T20 cricket, in terms of the eyeballs that it gets on, the money that it generates, and all of that kind of stuff. So the shift, I think there's no doubt that the 21st century, a lot of these names are going to be people that have influenced the T20 game, because that is the way that cricket is moving. It's going to be in the Olympics. We're obviously in it. As we're recording, there's Olympics going on at the moment. So I think that's really important. And can I just make the case? I want to make the case for Kieron Pollard to start with, because you guys talked a bit about Gayle before, and we sort of didn't mention Pollard. And I think that the thing that stood out to me is...
Did you just introduce a new player? Or did I do that in the first?
No.
He's on the list.
Pollard's on the list. Come on, Pixie. The thing that I think that stands out for me the most, I suppose, is he declined a contract in 2010, and very early on in his career, and also very early on in the formation of T20 cricket. At the time that he declined his contract, there were people out there still sort of saying, T20's a joke, it's not going to take on. The IPL had started, but, players, administrators, I think, and one of the board members for the West Indies, I think, said to him, do you want to be remembered as a legend, or do you want to be remembered as someone who's a mercenary? And what he was able to do is be both. He was able to go and do that. He was able to say, I'm going to back myself and say I'm still available for the West Indies, but I'm a young guy. I'm going to go and make this money. I'm going to go and play in all these leagues. Same sort of rationale, I think, as well, in terms of what you said, Binksy, about how Peterson tried to frame it as well by saying, look, I go and play in these leagues, I'm going to become a better cricketer. And I think if we're looking at, trendsetters for what the future of cricket is going to look like, contracting, the turning down central contracts, I don't think there's a better example really than Kieron Pollard and the way that he's sort of gone about things. And, you look around, he's been an incredible winner. He's won, I think, I tried to work it out, I think he's won 16 franchise titles. He's played there's 36 teams on his Cricinfo profile. I think that kind of cricketer is the kind of cricketer that we are going to see in the future. There are so many players now that are following that model more than anything else around the world.
Can I make the argument for Chris Gayle in rebuttal of your Pollard argument? Because all you've said is absolutely true. And these two, along with, I think, Andre Russell and I think you mentioned Bravo off air in between episodes.
Marines,
as well.
another one.
All of these...
naming new people.
Yeah, so we're going to discuss none of those guys except for Pollard and Gayle. So to make the argument for Chris Gayle having a greater influence than Pollard, yes, Pollard broke ground from a contractual perspective, and so did Gayle in terms of the way that they approached the game. But Chris Gayle was a personality and a headline act over and above Kieron Pollard from a popularity standpoint. So all other things being equal, Chris Gayle was a headline act that brought money to the game of T20 cricket. He brought an entertainment value and a cachet to the game when it desperately needed it in its formative years. And let's not forget that Chris Gayle still represented the West Indies in 100 test matches. So Kieron Pollard, as tremendous a cricketer as he was, never played test cricket for the West Indies. And I don't think he played more than about 30 first-class games. But Chris Gayle, in amongst all of his reputation for being a T20 mercenary, still turned out 100 times for the West Indies and scored 7,000 plus runs, scored a triple hundred, all of those things that he did. He also did them at test level as well. So yes, those guys both had tremendous impact on global cricket, but I think the West Indies, Chris Gayle had a tremendous impact for West Indies cricket as well, as did Kieron Pollard. And I grant you that I don't think without either of those two guys, the financial health of West Indian cricketers would be anything like it is today.
I also think, we don't want to go too deep into how good a cricketer they were either. We need to look at the other sort of side of the coin where it was his charisma that got people to want to watch him. Like if someone asked me, would you rather watch a random innings of Chris Gayle or a random innings of Kieron Pollard? I would always pick Chris Gayle. Similar to the layover test. I don't know if you guys know the layover test. When you're hiring, especially prominent in tech companies, who would you rather be stuck in an airport with, having a beer? And that is 100% Chris Gayle. Someone who can come up with the quote, "I'm jealous of my parents because I'll never have a kid as cool as they do." Like that's perfect. That sums him up in a nutshell.
I do think that your point around Gale's longevity as a test player and all that other stuff almost to me counts against him. Like if we're talking about influence and what the future is going to bring, like I said before, I think that there are people have seen the Pollard model and gone, that's where the game is going. So I suppose that's my argument. I mean, we don't need to talk for 10 minutes back and forth on these two, but yeah, that would be the case there about these two if you want to move on to the next kind of grouping.
So we're going to move on to the next grouping and we come back and we might have a couple of people out of a grouping. Chris Gayle on a layover, that would be dangerous. Potentially, you'd be in a pretty bad jail depending on where your layover was. Let's move into the next group. So we're going to cover off, I guess, the facilitators of an environment or a cricketing movement, and that's Brendon McCullum and probably Andrew Strauss. I know. Well,
aren't Dhoni and Kohli in that group as well? Really?
I think they're in the other group that we've got. So yeah, they're probably in the built aside whilst playing in it from scratch. Look, again, it's really difficult to put these into categories, but we split them into four categories earlier on. So let's cover off this BMAC and Strauss one. And I know obviously where it's going to end because I'm in a room with two Kiwis who, apparently are going to start chiseling their names on all kinds of trophies if England start to win them now as well. But no, let's talk about these two.
I mean, make the case why you think Strauss has had more of an impact than McCullum. Like, if we are just going to compare them,
and then we'll wake you up.
Yeah, look, all good. The reason I think that Strauss has a say in this, I think, is very, very well thought of, educated guy. Has been managing director of England cricket, so. Not just a player and coach and administrator, but he's kind of had that role of shepherding a vision. And I think, one of the things he's done is the high performance review recently for English cricket. He was the guy that identified that we needed to go out and get Trevor Bayliss as our one day coach. But ultimately, I think for me, there's an argument in here around his influence through such a large portion of the 20th century from a cricketing perspective. So as I said earlier on, came into the side, I think, round 03, 04, took over relatively quickly from a captaincy perspective and certainly into the side after Nasser Hussain, and then followed Michael Vaughan as captain, went and won on frontiers that we had not won on in international cricket for a period of time in Australia and India, and paved the way, I think, to do that in India more than being part of it. He just retired before then. And then he has made some really, really bold calls to get rid of a bunch of players after that 2015 World Cup. So look, I think in terms of that, the legacy that he then left with having Bayliss in charge, with working through the administration that now involves Rob Key and Brendon McCullum, he has essentially had 20 years influence on making England a side that got to number one in the world from a test perspective when we were shockingly bad prior to that. We then not won obviously a plethora of white ball trophies, and in the time he was involved with the side, we won in 2007 in the Caribbean, the T20 World Cup, the 2019 World Cup that he put the mechanism in place. He made the call on that well-documented white ball reset. And I don't want to diminish from McCullum because I've got a massive amount of time for the argument there. But I think for me, there is a little bit of a longevity piece and his willingness to do that over a long period of time, and put a lot of personal sacrifice into that. From an English perspective.
So you would have McCullum, Strauss over McCullum?
I want to hear the argument on McCullum. I think we talked a lot about this earlier on, and that Philip Hughes incident, the way that he moulded your side. With all due respect, your side wasn't as successful. So his influence on the game, absolutely, I'm not going to dispute. But you weren't winning the Ashes at that point. I say that flippantly, but you weren't going everywhere and winning. You created a really good environment, punched above your weight for a long period of time. I don't want to diminish New Zealand cricket in any way, but I don't think that the results of his influence were there as much as someone like Strauss. And then Strauss has done a similar thing to what McCullum's done in terms of helping to create some of those successful environments in a coaching or an administrative perspective. So that's my take on it, but I'm not. I can be convinced that McCullum wins this category.
Maybe I'll get you to pick up in a second, Raj, but I actually, as the more we're talking about these two, I actually think their cases are quite different in my head. So your point about Strauss and the longevity, I think, is a really valid one, and especially the case against McCullum is just what you said. He took over in 2012. We were in a wonderful side, but I think a lot of the culture wasn't great when he took over. And it took him a little while to turn that around. And by the time he had turned it around and we were starting to play well and play an attractive brand of cricket, he was ready to finish, and so he doesn't have that on his resume. And he was also, as you mentioned in the first part, of Stokes having some impact on what's happening in the red ball stuff now for England. We look at the New Zealand side, and he was also very lucky to be in an era of Kane Williamson and Tim Southee and Trent Boult and this generational, a generational group of New Zealand cricketers that then took up that culture that him and Hesson were accredited for starting, along with people like Mike Sandel, who are really, really important behind the scenes as well. And then Kane picked that up and got the success part of that. So I think that does count, I suppose, against McCullum in that case. But I think he's got sort of so many other strings to his bow. I think he's in as a player. We talked about, you mentioned the IPL 100, the way you talked about him scooping Sean Tate. I actually think that moment is a pretty significant moment. There's Dilshan and all these other guys who've played that shot. I think as soon as McCullum played that shot, everyone was like, anybody can do anything now. Like, if someone can scoop 100-mile-an-hour guy off their toes over the rope for six, then anything is possible in T20 cricket. And then now what he's doing with England, again, like it or not, and has it been as successful as maybe everyone would have liked? This attitude is changing what Test cricket is and is changing the game. So I think the influence part is hugely significant. Yeah, it's hard to I think they're very different cases.
Yeah, I choose Brendon McCullum. That's kind of where I sit on it. I think that his impact in the game, we've mentioned longevity, all of those sorts of things. Brendon McCullum hasn't actually had his shot yet. He's still got a long way to go in terms of his test career. Things go differently in the 2015 World Cup final. Who knows what could have happened? We got to a position where we probably could have won that game 150 for 3 at the 30th over.
Totally.
Springboarded to 300, put some real pressure on. Didn't happen. We bottled that. 2019 World Cup, we lost on the number of boundaries that were hit in the game. Not being flippant, but that's where it comes down.
I mean,
to.
he's not there though, is he?
I'm just talking about success. You're
Yes.
putting Strauss's success, and it was a massive change from the absolute disaster that was the 2015 World Cup for England to turn that around in 4 years to become the powerhouse that they were and continued to go on to with the other forms of white ball as well was definitely impressive. But that could have also been very different if it was very close that World Cup final. There are some people maybe in this room who say that it was a draw anyway. Maybe there isn't there's an asterisk next to it. I don't know. I don't know who those people are.
So on Brendon's behalf, you're claiming an asterisk World Cup that he wasn't a part of.
I'm adding an asterisk to Andrew Strauss's claim that they've won the 2019
Right, so
World
he
Cup.
wins on more asterisks.
Anyway, my point is, and it goes a lot with what Stu's going, is that if we're talking about influence on the game, his influence on 2020 cricket is profound. It's up there with the Chris Gales that we've talked about, Kieron Pollards that we've talked about. He is now, if you think back to Brendon McCullum 5-7 years into his career, he's batting at 7 in one-day cricket, closing games out, to actually revolutionising the game, the test game, the long form of the game, changing how we play that game. Scoring rate of 4, which the early Australians in the early 2000s, a run rate of 4 was incredible. Now it's slow for the English team. If they're going at 5, 6s, that's where they want to be going at. We've completely revolutionised the way.
He's not out there with the Puma, though, is he?
He's not, but it's definitely a way that he has put a lot of his selection policies in place, going, especially with someone like Ollie Pope, going, go out there, have a go. We're not going to drop you if you have a couple of bad performances, because I know you've got that good one in you. And you've shown that he's probably the poster boy for that change.
Okay. In summary, I'm happy to give McCullum if the other half of the face is Stokes then.
Fair enough. But no, look, I just think his if you look at it from his playing career, 2020 cricket, now through to coaching, which has still got a way to go, I think that he's had a profound impact on the game.
So, Bordy, I think you might have to have your say on this. We're talking about a double Ashes winning and World Cup administrator versus a guy with one series winning Test cricket for England over 3 years.
Why don't you move us on to the next one, Baldy? Why don't you talk about the Kohli and the Dhoni aspect? Because I think that's another fascinating conversation.
Who would you rather have a beer with, Strauss or McCullum?
Oh, that's tough. I think I'm more likely to miss my flight if I'm having a beer with McCullum. I feel like I'm more likely to miss my plane, but I think I would equally enjoy having a beer with Strauss, because I think it would be a very, very interesting.
We plans ahead, you'd get that plane and the next one.
Yeah, I'm sure I'd get to where I was going if I was having a beer with Strauss. Anyway, we'll move on before I say anything too controversial. I did want to talk. We do want to talk about MS Dhoni and about Virat. This was one of the really interesting points of our first episode about who had the greater impact in Indian cricket over the course of the 21st century. Dhoni was there first-ish. Dhoni has had tremendous success both as a leader in the Indian format, double World Cup winner, was really instrumental in giving India belief and starting to instigate some change in terms of, things like fitness levels and attitudes to the one percenters and all those little things that turned a team that was, no more or less chock full of superstars. I mean, Dhoni didn't inherit a side that had Dravid and Lakshman and Ganguly and Tendulkar in it all the time. He had to build his own identity in that Indian team, and he did it with Yuvraj and a whole host of other equally talented but different players. But he was also, he's also a 4 or 5-time IPL winner. I didn't check the facts in between episodes, but he's won stacks of IPLs as well. So he's that ultimate leader for that Indian team. He did it first. Kohli has taken that mantle, picked up the baton, whatever analogy you want to look at, and he's really run with it now. And India are a powerhouse under his leadership, and also under his increased focus on athleticism and fielding standards and all those things that the Indian team are known for now that they weren't known for as much prior to that.
That's the Kohli part that I think is the most significant, and I think, as I said in the first part, I think has set them up now for. I think his just drive and the level that he demands from the people around him. I think that it's raised the standard of everybody, and now everyone in Indian cricket has to measure up to what he's done and what he does on the way he goes about the game. And I think that he, like I said, I think there's just I cannot. I mean, there's so many factors to this, the money, and there's the sheer population and the number of people that play cricket in India, and all of that kind of stuff has also set them up for long success. But yeah, I think Kohli deserves a lot of credit for just that passion and drive to win, and also actually his. I don't think it's a small thing that his passion for Test cricket is why we see India play so much Test cricket. I think he deserves some credit for that. And, again, very, very, maybe it's drawing a long bow to the World Test Championship and actually trying to put some emphasis on Test cricket. Obviously, we're seeing around the world and everywhere outside of the big three, Test cricket, numbers of Tests playing in series is dropping. So you could probably make the counter argument. But I think that it's down to people like Virat Kohli who are still championing the Test cricket game that it is still hanging on as best as it is, I suppose. So yeah, look, again, kind of like Binksy said, these guys have both been massively influential. I don't necessarily, Raj was saying before, it's not mutually exclusive that these two can't both be side by side along this Rushmore when we get to there. But yeah, I don't know. It's that drive to just be those high standards and maintain those standards that I think has left India in a place where everyone in this next generation is now going to have to live up to those. And now you've got 50 people in India that are there set up to drive them forward.
I think the sort of best illustration of these two players' different legacies that they bring to the game is actually the most apparent in IPL cricket. You've got absolutely superstar teams, but only one of those two leaders is bringing everyone together to, a summation of parts, a synergy to actually win games. And I think that's where you see the difference between these two. Virat Kohli has some incredible sort of strings to his bow, elements to his leadership in that he is the fiery, aggressive one. He's going to go to Australia and he is going to fight fire with fire. That takes so much pressure off all the other players within his team. They're out of the media. It's all Virat Kohli this, Virat Kohli that, and he actually thrives on that. Whereas you look at Mahendra Singh Dhoni, he is a lot more circumspect, a lot more sort of pulled back, and he brings his players up with him. He doesn't put them on his back and drag them forward, which I think Virat Kohli does a lot of. If I were to look at this in another way, I'd think that there is an element that Virat Kohli is where he is because he's a great player, but also because he's standing on the shoulders of some giants that have come before him. Not only Mahendra Singh Dhoni, a lot of those Indian cricketers before him. But yeah, that's my argument for those two.
Yeah, I'll probably keep this relatively short for a change. I think I have to look at the winning records, and I think we look at Kohli's IPL records pretty poor, to be perfectly honest.
Individual records, right?
His individual record is fantastic, but what we're talking about here is his ability. He's in a category which is he's brought people along with him, and he's done that from a Test cricket perspective. But I just probably pose a couple of questions, and that's, I think if we look at India's silverware over the course of since 2000, there's a crossover period where both Dhoni and Kohli are in that. So I think if we go to that, 2011 World Cup, certainly maybe one of the Champions Trophies, they
2013.
They crossed over. I think we've obviously got the most recent win for India in this last edition of the World Cup. But Dhoni's got the IPL trophies to go with it. And I wonder whether or not we'd be having this conversation about Kohli if Dhoni hadn't come before to potentially, as Raj said, pave some of that way for him. Now, let me just nail my colours to the mast. The layover test is a slightly different one, but the who do I want to watch batting? 100% Kohli, because that is just absolute silk in a glass all day long. Watching him bat. Layover test, I really can't answer. I don't know. But I think on that basis, for me, if I had to pick one of these two out of this category, Dhoni would be the one that would pip it.
And so, Bully, you can start us off again. The next category is kind of the individuals who sort of changed various parts of the game rather than necessarily had an impact on the overall game, although they did have their impact as well in their specific area where we're sort of thinking. Is there anyone that stands out in that category that you think deserves to be alongside these others?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one because each of them in their own right were tremendously impactful inside their own discipline. And a lot of them have changed the way that cricket is played to a certain extent. We've talked about Lasith Malinga and he's changed. He broke the mold for fast bowlers in that biomechanics era and really changed the way that bowlers operate and think about bowling at the death, and he executed as well, if not better than anyone else throughout his career. I talked about Tilakaratne Dilshan in terms of, accessing different parts of the ground, and now we see batters playing in the 21st century in terms of the way that they access the ground completely differently to the way that, traditionally a Ponting or a Damien Martin or I was going to say Joe Root then, but that's not a great example because he does access those parts of the ground now. But players have broken the ground for him to be able to do that, right? And Dilshan, I think, was instrumental in that. We also talked about Rashid Khan, and I think, among other things, I would disagree with you a little bit, Stu, in that I think that there are other leg spinners and other spin bowlers who deserve a mention for creating deliveries, changing their craft as much, if not more, than Rashid Khan did in their careers. I'm not allowed to mention them by name because we can't bring other people into it. But I think...
Your rules.
I know, my rules, and I'll stick to them. But I think there are others that would be in that same conversation as Rashid in terms of new techniques, different types of deliveries, different wrist positions and angles and all the rest of it. So from a technical perspective, there are others alongside him. But I want you to talk to me again about the impact that he's had on associate cricket and smaller nations having the ability to elevate themselves into an international window that can have impact around the rest of the world.
Well, yeah, I do think that is quite significant. And the way, as I said in the first part when we were introducing him, I think that, my belief anyway, that the fact that he was so successful going around the world and being a franchise player, it had the impact that all these franchises from all over the world started looking outside of the test playing nations, for one. And it also meant the ICC has this star to say, let's get Afghanistan into test cricket. Let's get them into, all of these World Cups. Let's kind of fast track that because, one, we've got the star and we can see how much talent there, because we can see how good he is. We can see how much talent there is around, in that nation and in the Afghanistani cricketers. And again, on that same sort of point, I don't know the women's game as well as you do, and as well as probably lots of our other listeners and viewers do. But if you're saying Ellyse Perry is the number one, I would say that's the same thing. Like if you look at where women's cricket was in 2000, if we're talking about this century, where it is now to where we've got, the WBBL, we've got, and we've got the WIPL or whatever it's called, the Women's 100. We've got, pay equity here in New Zealand in terms of match fees and things. Like that is perhaps the most drastic change out of everything in terms of what, one particular area of the game where things have changed. So I think, if we're talking about their specific area of the game, Perry's got to be right in the mix as well. So
yeah, I think there are other cricketers that we should include in the mix in terms of changing their discipline. Adam, I want to come to you next, but just before we move off, I think it would be it would be disingenuous to put all of the success of women's cricket and the many, many women that we haven't talked about as being influential in terms of building the profile of women's cricket. I won't mention names because we're barred from doing so. But to put it all on Ellyse Perry's shoulders is unfair to all the rest of them. But I think if you had to single out one player, Ellyse Perry is the ultimate role model for women cricketers and for men cricketers in Australia over the last 15 or 16 years, and has been the face of Australian women's cricket for a long, long period of time, during which the profile of women's cricket, both in Australia and globally, grew from not worth a mention in many bars and pubs around the world to something that is talked about. You know, the 90,000 people that came and watched Australia play in the World Cup final in Melbourne. Katy Perry was there, but Katy Perry was not the headline act. It was the Australian women's cricket team playing in a World Cup final against India. So I think, you know, for me, in terms of influencing a whole segment of cricket that was previously untapped at the start of the century, Ellyse Perry has to have some consideration in terms of our influence. Before we get to the voting and the deciding and the chiseling of names, Adam, I just don't want to leave you without the ability to talk about one more player.
Yeah, and look, I think that's Adam Gilchrist, and I kind of listened to your impassioned arguments for Rashid Khan, Ellyse Perry to a certain extent, and Lasith Malinga. When I kind of look at that, and we talk about Lasith Malinga, he's paved the way for unorthodoxy in terms of bowling. We can probably name 3 or 4 guys that have followed in that respect, and maybe one of them, Bumrah, is one of the all-time greats. When we talk about Rashid Khan, okay, he's probably paved the way for Noor Ahmed and a couple of others that we might be able to mention. I think when we look at Gilchrist, he has, in my view, and I'm biased because I'm a wicketkeeper, but I'm also, I think, measured because he's an Australian wicketkeeper, and I don't want to give props to an Australian wicketkeeper. He has paved the way for McCullum and Bairstow and Sangakkara and Butler and Pant and Rizwan and Kishan.
De Villiers.
The names go on in terms of what his impact from 1999. So there's an argument that he falls just outside that window, but the large majority of his Test career, he debuted 99, and that was the winter, the November, I think, of 1999. He has essentially created the need for the firepower at the top of the order as a wicketkeeper batter in T20 and one-day international cricket. There's an argument that Kalu maybe started that in 96. But again, if we talk about that, I'm going to borrow this till I'm dead, the Jimmy Anderson wobble seam thing. Kalu might have been the first one with the wobble seam from a wicket-keeping perspective, but Gilchrist is the one who's perfected it. And I think that impact on the game, it's changed the way that cricket is played. It has made it a truly 11-man sport rather than a 10-man sport with a guy that catches the ball for the 5 bowlers, if that makes sense.
Very good. Good argument.
My only argument out of all of those, I agree with Gilchrist. I agree with a lot of the people that you've talked about there. My probably argument against Rashid Khan is the problem with Rashid Khan, and I know we're not allowed to talk about people that we haven't spoken about before.
I'm getting a lot of grief for a rule that I didn't create.
I know everyone looks at you when we say that, but I think that was me.
The problem that Rashid Khan comes up against is that he has played in the same time as some absolute giants of spin bowling. Overlapped, I'm sure. I'm sure they've overlapped. Well, definitely with Murali, maybe. I'm not sure if they've overlapped, but they're very close. Anyway, watchers of cricket have been able to see Murali, see Shane Warne bowl, as well as watch Rashid Khan bowl for the next 10 years as well. They've been able to see it all.
Ashwin line.
If you went and asked a normal person in the street, Shane Warne or Rashid Khan, in terms of influence, maybe your kids who are older than probably my kids, they probably more know who Shane Warne and Murali is rather than Rashid Khan or some of the other spinners that we've talked about. That's my only argument for Rashid Khan. And it's not that anything to take away against him. It's just the field that he's up against is incredibly talented in the recent time.
I think we've got to nail our colours to the mast, team. I think we've got to start actually putting some names and faces on this Mount Rushmore of influential 21st century cricketing figures. Is there anyone that we think we might have consensus on? So do we want to throw a name out there? I think I've got Gayle on my list. Has anyone not got Chris Gayle on their list? Can we get some consensus?
So top four.
Top four.
Gayle's in my top four.
Gayle's in your top four.
Gales, yeah.
Gayle's there.
I still think Pollard. If I've only got room for one of those guys, and I think probably the way my formula is, I'm going to say Pollard, and we're going to differ. But it's because of that contractual stuff. I think we're going to see, more Pollards in the future, and we sort of have been trending that way than Gayle. That's my only argument.
Well, I think the only way that you could refute that is to say that there is only really one universe boss.
It is unique.
And you're never going to see his like again. So we have some reasonable consensus on Chris Gayle. Does anyone else want to throw a name out there that they think we might have some consensus on? Because I think that Chris Gayle's almost etched on there at this point.
I've got Dhoni on mine.
Dhoni's my number one.
I'm
Chris Harris.
I'm just trying to think of who else I want to include on here, and
If go last every time.
I'm going to stick with Kohli. I think Kohli's taking this spot and influence. But I think again, it's sort of influence is slightly. The way we view influence is why this is happening.
I can't not have MS Dhoni on my list for all the reasons we've mentioned. I think all other things being equal, if I wanted someone to captain my cricket side and I wanted someone to lead me to a World Cup, I would want Dhoni in front of Virat. And I know Virat would score 900 runs in that tournament, but if I just could pick one leader to lead my ultimate cricket side, do
you guys have Virat as well? Or has he missed out?
He's missed out for me. But he hasn't missed out. He has missed out for me.
Yeah, he's missed out for me as well.
I could be convinced that he should be in there. I have Ellyse Perry.
We've spent an hour and a half talking, more than an hour and a half. So if you're not convinced now, then I think we give up.
I could be completely convinced. I have Ellyse Perry in my fourth spot, mainly because of all of the things that we've talked about in terms of bringing a completely new market to cricket. And that's why I have Ellyse Perry in my spot. But if I had to name a male cricketer in that fourth spot, it would be Virat.
Do you know what? In talking it out, I've actually put Ellyse Perry on mine, and that's why I don't have Dhoni, because the argument that you were making, and then I picked up on that the difference, again, it's not just Ellyse Perry, but the difference of where women's cricket was in 2000 to where it is now, I think is one of the most drastic things that we've kind of talked about. And I think, again, we're not just pinning it all on Ellyse Perry, but if we're saying that she's had a big impact on that, I think, she deserves a spot on there. And that's why I've made that decision as well. Who else did we have in there? We had McCullum.
McCullum is on my list.
And Strauss.
McCullum is on my list as well, and maybe this is just us sitting here, New Zealanders, but I sort of think that at least again in the way I view cricket, he's had such an impact in so many different areas. All of the things that you're talking about with Gayle, I think also apply to McCullum in terms of T20 cricket and the impact that he had, and even to a degree again, it's Gilchrist is the one that kind of started it off and probably deserves more credit than McCullum for that kind of thing. But the way he went about things as a wicketkeeper, all of those kind of things, the way he's test cricket, the way, all of those things, the culture, everything. I think he's kind of just got the full package in terms of his influence on the game. So
I don't have him on my list. So I have, so I think where we're at votes wise is we've got 3 votes for Gayle. We've got 3 votes for Dhoni. We've got 2 votes for Perry. We've got 2 one-eyed New Zealand votes for McCullum. And then we're going to have a bunch of people that are going to probably sit on one vote. I think the McCullum one, look, I can be convinced either way, but I'm still not going to vote for him. And I'm probably not going to vote for it's certainly not going to vote for him ahead of Strauss because I think there's a bit of a recency bias in there. And ultimately, he doesn't have results to put on the board. And I think, okay, we're talking about influence. But yeah, in my view, Strauss has got a different legacy that he's leaving, which is some trophies in the cabinet. The one that I honestly can't believe that we're not going to come round on is Gilchrist. Because
he's on my list.
Yeah, okay. Because that for me, when I actually then think about what he's created, particularly when we throw the Rashid Khans and the Lasith Malingas into that list, and then we throw in, McCullum did a similar thing with the gloves as well. This is the pioneer of it. I'm sorry,
don't disagree.
And I think that I mean, we're going to have to do the ears on Rushmore, which is going to, a bit more chiseling. But ultimately,
that took a while to get through to me. What are you talking about?
But yeah, ultimately, I think Gilchrist has got to be on there, and that'd be the one that I would. I'll throw Strauss to the wolves if we can get Gilchrist on there.
That's interesting. So we have no one that we have a
consensus.
On?
Yeah.
Should we just do our own? Once more,
could.
More for the listeners, and for our own.
Yeah,
but I think we've. It seems like we've settled on about 4 or 5 that are pretty close to at least a vote for us. Listeners, if you've stuck with us for almost 2 hours, then please throw in your comments and your top 4s in the list for sure.
We've got to come up with 4 boards.
Okay.
So can you put some science and some algorithm
Right.
around? That's the votes.
Right.
So we can agree that 3 people voted for Gayle, I think.
Gayle, 3.
Why don't we do our individual ones and then Baldy can put the
Baldy can decide. Baldy gets the final vote on the influencer.
Great.
So my 4 is
in order.
Oh, do I have to do them in order?
That helps.
Well, I didn't rank them in order. So I've got Kohli, Pollard, Perry, and McCullum are my 4.
Okay, for me, order's a hard one, but I came in here with 3 and I was waiting to be convinced of the 4th from the panel here. So I've got Chris Gayle first, MS Dhoni in second, and Brendon McCullum in third. And then the 4th one that I've been convinced on is Adam Gilchrist. And I agree with everything that's been said about him in this discussion today.
I'm going Dhoni at number 1. I've actually switched my order, so I'm going to go with Gilchrist at number 2. Gayle at number 3, and I'm sticking on it. I'm sticking on the Strauss train at number 4.
Fair enough. Well, I have, and I'll put it in front of Adam so he can see and everyone else can see. I had Gayle, Dhoni, and Perry as locks in my list, and I left the 4th one open. I was actually prepared to be convinced that Brendon McCullum was going to be the 4th person on my list, but actually, I think that I would go with Gilchrist. We don't actually have, as much as I'd like to say it on this list, a pure player on Mount Rushmore. All these other guys have done other things to influence the game of cricket. No one is on here purely as a player, and so I'm going to have Gilly on my list, and he's going to be the 4th. Now, people are going to write in and say that Michael is biased because he's got 2 Australians on the list. I actually came prepared to have no Australians on the list, to be honest. I thought it was going to be Dilshan and Gayle.
So you do it so you get 2.
Yeah.
So you've ended up with 50%.
Exactly. So I have Gilchrist on my list. I could be convinced that Brendon McCullum or Strauss is an equal partner. But
So we've got Dhoni, Gayle, Perry, and Gilchrist that's our Rushmore. I'm happy. I mean, I'm okay with that.
McCullum has 2 votes not on the list. Virat, I think, did Virat end up getting a vote?
Yeah, you got 1 vote, I
He got
think.
1.
Yeah.
1 vote from Stu. Strauss got a vote, didn't get in the list.
There you go, listeners and viewers. That is perhaps the biggest schmozzle of a Rushmore.
I can't believe we got there.
The biggest schmozzle of a Rushmore that we've ever had. We are an hour and a half deep. This is longer than an episode of the Rewatchables.
We thought this was going to be half an hour, didn't we?
We did, yeah. We've missed the rugby. I think I've missed my first grandchild's christening as well. But look, anyway, that is all we've got time for, literally, on the Top Order podcast this week. Please do dig back into the back catalogue. I know from a personal perspective, and I mentioned this on the first episode, I listened back to probably one of my favourite conversations I've ever had in my life, which was the episode we recorded with Graham Thorpe. Back around about 2020 when those COVID test matches were going on. He was in the England camp as an assistant coach, one of my cricketing heroes, gone far too early. But we've got a lot of other stuff in the back catalogue as well for you to dip back into. We'll be back, though, next week talking about some live cricket. We've got Test cricket kicking off again, the 100 finishing up. And we'll also talk a little bit of Indian cricket as well next week as they wrap up their one-day series against Sri Lanka. So all coming up on future episodes of the Top Order podcast. But for now, it is good night and good bless from us all here in Auckland, New Zealand. We'll see you later. Good night.